Okay, so the first thing we're going to demonstrate here today is the minestrone soup. Before I do anything else, I want to get some water boiling to cook the pasta. The recipe says you can cook it in the soup or separately. I would always recommend to cook it separately so you have a little bit more control. And you can add the pasta at the perfect time to the soup so that it's perfectly cooked. So we have some water boiling. It's not a whole lot of pasta, so we don't need a ton of water. But we do want it at a very nice full boil, and we want lots of salt in there. It's pretty hard to add too much salt to pasta because you could always give it a rinse if you need to, but we do want to make sure there's an adequate amount to season it properly. We'll add the pasta into there, and ideally you always want to have enough water in your pot so that the pasta doesn't cool it down too much. When you add the pasta, it should still be boiling like it is here now, so that's great to see. So what we'll do is a few of the knife cuts for the vegetables here, because they're very important skills. We thought we'd go through that today. So first of all, doing an onion small diced. This has already been started for me, but what you're going to do is take off the end opposite the root, so I guess the stem end of the onion. You're going to cut that off of the whole onion, stand it up, and then cut this in half, like so, and peel off the outer layer. I like to leave a little bit of that root on the onion to make it a little bit easier for everything to stay together while I'm doing the dicing. So then what I'll do is just make some parallel cuts about 1/4 of an inch apart, following the round shape of the onion all the way through here. Just keeping my fingers out of the way. So now I've mirrored the shape of the onion all the way down, and I'll turn it so it's perpendicular to my knife, and I'm going to do 1/4 inch cross cuts across that. Of course, you have the layers of the onion naturally occurring, so what we end up with is some nice little 1/4 inch squares, which is our small dice of onion. So that's going to go in the soup first. So we have a pot going. And we're going to put a little bit of olive oil in here. We don't need a whole bunch. The biggest thing with this is to watch the temperature of your pot so that it's not getting too hot, nothing's burning, especially when you practice at the school and then you come here to Nate with our gas stoves. You might find they heat up a lot faster and they get a lot hotter than an electric stove. So you do want to be careful of that. And I guess I should add, just with the pasta, our standard is to do 7 minutes for dry pasta, so I will just set a timer. I'm about a minute late, but that's okay. And that's just a general rule of thumb for cooking pasta. That's usually the perfect amount of time. So I have some onions already diced. We'll throw that in here and get that started. So I let my pot heat up first before I added the oil. That's a really important principle of cooking with stainless steel like this or aluminum. Just helps prevent things from sticking. Add the rest of our onions in there. And then the other cut that I wanted to demonstrate is our small diced carrot. We'll just take the end off. And what I want to do is cut a manageable chunk of this carrot that's fairly consistently sized. So find a point where it really starts to taper off, and we'll cut right there. Straighten it out, and you want to take one edge of this off, just a thin edge so that it sits flat, and then we'll go around and form a rectangular prism here. So we'll just flatten that out all around. And any of my scraps from the onions and carrots and celery we'll save and use for the beef stock to make our peppercorn sauce. So now that I have this nice workable box here, I want to do 1/4 inch slices, just like I did with the onion. And then I will stack up these 1/4 inch slices and cut my nice batons. We'll come back to this later when we do the carrot batonette. And then we'll just make 1/4 inch cuts across that as well. So that's our small diced carrot. Okay. So with this vegetable soup, the goal is that when you take a spoonful, when it's being served, every piece of vegetable in there is perfectly cooked. And so to accomplish that, we have to think about what order we're adding things in. And the recipe document does sort of walk you through that. I always like to add my onions first, not because they're really crunchy, but because that strong onion flavor wants to mellow out a little bit. We want to cook that out. So we'll let that saute a little bit first, and then we'll add our carrots, because they're probably the firmest of all the other vegetables that we have to cook. So the zucchini will cook very quickly, so we can add that near the end. But the onions and carrots especially we want to get going. Then we'll add our celery, and then our zucchini, and then our cabbage and tomatoes at the end. So one good principle when you're cooking something like a vegetable soup is to try to season in layers. So we do have the first bit of vegetables in here, so we'll add a little bit of salt now. Maybe I'll add a little bit of cracked pepper now as well, and let the spice toast in that hot pan a little bit. It brings out a little more of the flavor. So we'll add that. So this is gonna saute for probably about 5 minutes. We'll just keep an eye on it, keep stirring it. I've got it on a medium heat right now. And then we'll just check our pasta. So even though we are going to use a timer for cooking our pasta, the best way to tell if it's perfectly cooked is always to taste it. Stir, we'll pull a little bit out. And we'll have a quick taste of this. It's almost there. I have 3 minutes left on my timer, but I think it'll be done a little bit sooner. Let's get this out of the way. And when the pasta is fully cooked, we're going to drain it using a colander. Just toss a little bit more olive oil in it so it's not drying out on us. And we'll set that aside just to cool down until it's ready to be added to the soup. Just make sure that's not boiling over. You can add a little splash of oil to this pot as well, just to prevent it from boiling over on you. So we'll add our celery now. In another minute, I'll add the zucchini and let that go. A couple more minutes. And then finally, we'll add the cabbage. We're using crushed tomatoes, so they're fully cooked, so they don't need to go in to saute with everything else. And then once all of those vegetables are finished sauteing, we'll add our stock. And then we have a little bit of chopped parsley and some basil. And the recipe says to add the basil with the stock, but this isn't a really important consideration, but personally, I would say add the basil at the very, very end, and it will stay a nice bright green for you. So we'll just get it ready now. We'll chiffonade that and add it at the very end. So to chiffonade the basil, this is the same way you do the cabbage. You just take the leaves, stack them up nicely, give it a little roll, and we'll just gently run our knife through the basil, cutting nice, even, shredded pieces, like so. That'll make a really nice garnish for the finished soup. So I know my vegetables are getting close to ready when the onions and celery start to look a little bit translucent. They lose their really solid color. And I do actually have some garlic to add to this. Somewhere we have some garlic, we'll find that. The garlic you never want to add at the beginning because it has such a small dice, it's so much surface area, it'll burn very easily in your pot. So this is where I would add the garlic right now. So we'll take the pasta off. It's good now. I'm just going to drain it using a strainer here. We don't need the water for anything. And then we'll set this aside just to cool down with a little bit of oil on it to add to the soup at the very end. So our zucchini. Cabbage going in there. The cabbage, again, similar to the basil, just a chiffonade. So you're going to get some nice evenly sized leaves, stack them up, and just run your knife through it in nice even motions to get those consistent cuts like that. We'll season that a little bit more now that we've added all these other vegetables, so a little bit more salt. I can see a good amount of pepper in there, so it's probably enough. And I would encourage you to taste as you go with these sorts of steps as well, just to make sure your seasoning is adequate and not too much. So we'll let this cook for about 5 more minutes, and then we'll add our liquid ingredients and bring it to a simmer and finish it up. Okay, so we're back to finish the minestrone soup here. So we added the tomato and the stock and brought that to a boil, turned it down to a simmer, and simmered it until all of our vegetables were properly cooked. So I would try to stay away from just setting a timer at this point and just saying, okay, it's simmered for 10 minutes, it's done. You need to be tasting and making sure your vegetables are the way they should be. So a little bit of bite, or as we say, al dente. And now we're just going to add our pasta because it's fully cooked and still hot. So we'll just add that in. Give that a little scrape here. And then we have our beans as well that are fully cooked. And so I did not mention this at the beginning, but make sure you get your beans to the fully cooked stage as soon as possible. So get a pot on, get those going so that they're nice and plump and cooked like this. So we'll add those in as well. And we'll just let this come back up to a bit of a simmer so we know everything's nice and hot. And then we'll plate it up. So we have our soup bowls here. And as I said, we want these chopped herbs to stay nice and green, so it's the very last thing to go in the pot. So it's good, nice and hot. We'll add those, give it a little stir. And then one thing that's important here is if you're doing 3 or 4 bowls of soup, you need some consistency between each bowl. So you don't want all the vegetables in one bowl and all broth in another. So we'll just use a smaller ladle so we have a little bit more control of what's going in here. And what we're looking for with this soup is these nice bright colors. So we haven't excessively cooked anything. We haven't simmered all of the life out of the vegetables. They're just the right texture, just al dente, and not much further than that. And that's what we want. There you go. So a nice, beautiful, colorful bowl of minestrone ready to go.